Hello students, welcome to this lecture 1.3 on West African history and culture. In this lecture, I will explain why West Africa matters. Why do we have to study West Africa? Then I will talk about the West African kingdoms and give a summary of the West African culture. First, why does West Africa matter? As we will see in the map below, a map on the Atlantic slave trade, only a small percentage of Africans who were brought to America, only a small percentage of the slaves who came from Africa went to North America, to the United States and Canada. Nevertheless, the great majority of those who were brought to North America came from West Africa. Up to 80% of them actually came from West Africa. So this is the map I was telling you earlier. This map shows us that the majority of the slaves who were brought to America came from the western and central part of Africa, and very few of them came from East Africa. And with regard to the destination of the slaves in America, the great majority of these slaves were sent to South America and the Caribbean islands. As you can see that Brazil was the place where most of the slaves went. Up to 50% of the African slaves actually went to Brazil. And on the top, you can see that a small percentage of the slaves were sent to North America, which means to the United States and Canada. But all of them, almost all of them, came from West Africa. Therefore, West Africa is very important to understand the history of African Americans in the United States. The slaves from West Africa brought with them to North America their culture, such as music, cuisine, and even their language. You may have heard of the Low Country in South Carolina who are speaking languages from West Africa. They also had tremendous influences on the African American culture and even on the American culture in general. One example that I can tell you right now is the jazz music actually was influenced by, if not created by, African Americans, and these are African Americans who came from West Africa. So, West Africa was known as the Western Sudan in history, in history literature. The people of West Africa started growing crops, including especially millet and rice. They also domesticated animals and were mining gold and iron since 1000 before Christ. They also had extensive trade with the Arabs through the Sahara Desert. The most famous West African kingdoms were Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The maps of these kingdoms were empires. If they are small, they are just kingdoms, but if they become large, they are called empires. So the maps of these West African kingdoms or empire will be shown on the next slide, along with the time frames of their existence. So this is a figure with maps of the three most famous West African kingdoms. Starting on the top left, we have Ghana, which existed from about 700 to 1076 AD. This kingdom was the earliest and also the smallest. Next to Ghana on the top right, we have Mali, which existed from 1230 to 1468. Mali extended from the modern state of Nigeria and Niger in Central Africa all the way to the west coast to the modern day Senegal. Finally, at the bottom of this figure, you have a map of Songhai, the Empire of Songhai, which existed from 1464 to 1591. So Songhai was there when the Europeans came to trade slaves with the Africans. And Songhai was the latest and also the most powerful West African kingdom. The most important information that we need to remember about Ghana is this. It was created by the Soninke people about 700 AD. The Ghanaians traded also with the Arabs. They exchanged slaves and gold for silk, cotton, glass, beads and horses with the Arabs. The capital city called Kumbi Saleh had about 20,000 people in 1100. So by the time, that's a large city with 20,000 people. Finally, Ghana was invaded by the Arabs in 1076. With regard to Mali, we have to remember that it was created by the Mandike people, who were led by the legendary king known as Sundiata Keita. Even today, people in West Africa still talk about this king Sundiata Keita. Mali was larger and more wealthy than Ghana. It reached its peak under King Mansa Musa, which was known as one of the richest people in the world at that time, even today. Mali was influenced by Islam, so many Malians embraced the religion of Islam, and the King Mansa Musa went to pilgrimage to Mecca. The capital city of Mali was Timbuktu, which has mosques, Islamic schools, even law schools, where they study Islamic laws. They even have book dealers. So Timbuktu was one of the most important trading and learning centers in Africa for many years, even for many decades. Concerning the empire of Songhai, we have to remember that it was created by the Songhai people who seceded from the kingdom of Mali, or the empire of Mali, in 1475. Songhai was led by the legendary king Sunni Ali. As you can see by the name, he was a Muslim, and Sunni Ali built this large West African empire. But the most famous king of Songhai was Askia Mohammed Toure, who was a devout Muslim and also known for his pilgrimage to Mecca. He also had diplomatic relations with the countries of or kingdoms of Morocco and Egypt, and he was also known for building the Sankore Mosque in Timbuktu, which I believe still exists today. And the capital city of Songhai is Timbuktu. So these are the three most famous West African kingdoms and empire, but there are other kingdoms and empire, but these are the three most important of them that we have to remember. Now, let's talk about the main characteristics of a West African culture. In West Africa and in Africa generally, the family and the village play very important roles in the lives of individuals. So even today, the family and village are very important. A family can be either patrilineal or matrilineal, which means they are patrilineal with affiliation is through the male, so from father to son, and they are matrilineal with affiliation or through the mother. But the individuals, whether the family is patrilineal or matrilineal, the individuals get their names, get their inheritance and their property, especially the use of land, through the family. So if you live outside the family, you may not have a property, you cannot use any land and cannot own any inheritance. So that's why the family is very important. With regard to the village, the village constitutes a social, economic and political unit in Africa even today. And this led to the saying in West Africa, which say that it takes a village to raise a child. Concerning the West African society in general, women play a very important role in the family and the village in Africa. Women enjoy some freedom. They even have, according to many studies, they even have more sexual freedom than European women. And today, if you go to West Africa, you may hear the story of women who can have more than one husband. So that tells you about women's power, but also sexual freedom of women in West Africa. The African society also was divided in different social classes, including a class of slaves. But the slaves in West Africa were generally war captives. So these are people who were captured during the war between kingdoms or between ethnic groups or tribes. The slaves also could be sold, but the most important thing in Africa was that the children of slaves were not slaves themselves. So these children were free. The most important elements of West African culture include religion, art and music. Most West Africans practice Islam since the 8th or 9th century, but many of them, even today, practice traditional religion or animism. Concerning art and music, these are generally tied with religious practice, which means that West Africans and Africans in general did not enjoy art and music for pleasure, but they are using art and music as part of their religion. So these are part of religious practices. So these are the most important information that we have to remember about West African kingdoms and West African culture in general. So this concludes lecture 1.3 on West African history and culture. Please move to lecture 1.4 to continue this module.